Okay, we are on row 7, the last row of the presentation and oral defense rubric. Let's get through this so that we can do a final summary of the rubric and practice scoring some student work. Row 7 of the rubric is the second row of the rubric that pertains to students' reflection throughout the inquiry process. In particular, this row deals with whether or not the student can respond to a question about being reflective about their choices, their influences, challenges, and achievements throughout the inquiry process, and how that is significant to their own understanding, realization, self-awareness, or personal learning, and not necessarily just the new understanding or conclusion that they came to as a result of their inquiry process. As a side note, this is where the effective use of the process and reflection portfolio, otherwise known as the PREP, throughout the year can really help the students score well on this row of the rubric. So, if a student was asked the first question on this list about which sources were most influential and in what way was that influence apparent in their final conclusion, we expect students to identify that source or sources, but also to provide an explanation of the significance of that source to their new understanding and why they decided that it was going to be significant. This why description really gets at whether or not students were thinking about their own thinking. It's one thing to say, I chose something, and it's another to tell us the thought process about why that choice was made. This is true reflection, and it's crucial to students effectively engaging in research. As always, remember, you don't have to ask a question from this list verbatim. The question should be tailored to suit the student's actual research project, but the question asked should not be so changed as to leave it unrecognizable from this list and the intent of this list. Let's look at the verbs, qualifiers, and conjunctions as we examine row 7 of the rubric. As a reminder, this is a 2-column row of the rubric, so instead of thinking of the cells as low, medium, or high, let's think of them as not proficient versus proficient. For example, in the not proficient column, the student must make a connection to personal learning or self-awareness, but might not necessarily answer the question posed. Now, let's say, for example, that a student was asked if they had 3 more months, what additional strategies might they put in place in their inquiry process? If a student responds by saying, the research process was very difficult, and if they'd known it was going to be this hard, they wouldn't retake the class. This response earns 0 points, because they didn't tell us what they would do if they had 3 more months, and they didn't connect their choice to any personal learning or realizations. However, if the student says that they wouldn't retake the class because they realize it takes too much self-direction, which they feel they lack, well, now the student still hasn't told us what they would do with 3 more months, but has at the very least made a superficial connection between the inquiry process and personal learning or self-awareness. That response would earn 1 point, or at least be in the not proficient column. Now, in order for the response to cross over into the proficient column, the student must first answer the question posed. And let's go to our question from before. The student might say, oh, if I had 3 more months, I would have surveyed about 100 more people, which is a strategy they could employ. But now the student must explain how that strategy is significant to their own learning or understanding made in the research process. And to that end, the student might say, and I would survey 100 more people because I realize having a larger sample size would increase the extent to which I could generalize my conclusion to the population I sampled. And this additional explanation shows us the significance of this strategy to the student's own learning about valid research processes. So, in effect, if the student can either provide a superficial response to the question or a superficial connection of personal learning or self-awareness to the context of inquiry without actually answering the question, then that's not proficient. Or they can answer the question posed and explain the significance of that response to their research conclusion, to their own understanding about their research process, or even to the understanding about themselves, pertaining to the paradigms, biases, and even skill level. All right, let's look at some examples. Row 7 is about reflecting throughout the inquiry process or thinking about your own thinking. We need to know if the student can actually answer the question posed and then describe the connection of their response to their own understanding or personal learning in the context of inquiry or even awareness about their own paradigms, biases, or skill level. In the alcohol abuse and commercial sample, at time about 1441, the student is asked about what an unanticipated turn she encountered as her research progressed, the reason for this turn, and the effect of this turn on her method or approach. She states that she originally planned to only perform a correlational research method, but after reading another paper, she realized that there were discrepancies leading to inconclusive correlations, and so she decided to add a content analysis approach to her method. She clearly answers the question posed and ties it back to her realization or personal learning and how it altered her research process. Therefore, she reaches the proficient block of this row. Compare that to the Comfort Women video. The student is asked about additional research strategies that she could implement if given more time, at around time 1627. The student mentions that her current geographical location is a detriment to her interviewing subjects in person rather than online. However, she fails to mention how the in-person interviews might be a better method in respect to personal learning about the inquiry process, and she also fails to connect how this strategy is related to having 3 more months. To be blunt, how is having 3 more months going to solve the problem of geographic location? Are you going to move? Since we're left with trying to make the connections of personal learning or connecting to the question posed, the superficial response about doing interviews instead of surveys cannot jump over the fence into the proficient column. So, row 7 focuses on students being able to connect what they did in the inquiry process to their own personal learning or self-awareness pertaining to biases, paradigms, or initial skill level. In order to get a 0, a student would have to simply not answer the question posed. I have seen one such sample. They do actually say something, but they're not answering the question. The student doesn't provide a response to what was asked, but instead simply states they hated the class and wish they'd never taken it. This is not a realization or self-awareness about skill level or biases. This is simply a rant. Not proficient responses are seen when students can say how they change throughout the inquiry process, but might not answer the question posed, or when they respond to the question posed but cannot connect that response to their own personal growth, realizations, or changes during the inquiry process. And even if they do make such a connection, it's very superficial. Proficient responses will show that the student can respond to the question posed and can describe its connection to their conclusion, their own personal learning, and the context of inquiry or self-awareness. Wow, we did it. We have now reviewed all 7 rows of the presentation and oral defense rubric in detail. We got one more thing to do. Let's look at a summary of what we've learned with this next and final presentation, and then you'll be ready to practice scoring some samples and then go on to certification.